Kia ora anō, koutou katoa. I'm Brendan Rigby from the Shift Aotearoa, putting together some content for VisionWeek here, which is running this week from the 8th till the 12th of June. Today I am talking with Greer O'Donnell and Imogen Schutz about community-focused affordable housing, which is a really important input into the future of housing in New Zealand, because we don't have a great diversity of ownership models or living models. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for having a look at our content. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Imogen to give us a little introduction. Kia ora, Imogen.
Kia ora. Thanks, Brendan. So where to start? I suppose it's not a well understood term, and we'll go into the models, I suppose, in a bit more detail and try and explain what they are. But we're interested, I suppose, in providing more housing that suits the needs of what we call the missing middle, the people that don't qualify for social housing and trapped, I suppose, in the private market, but would ideally like to be able to buy their own home and generally can't afford to do so. So yeah, I identify in that category myself. I've spent more than 2 decades potentially in that space, so I'm quite passionate and understand what that means in terms of the impacts it has on other aspects of your life, and how, yeah. I mean, obviously a stable home has so many other benefits, impacts onto one's life.
Yeah,
a stable home allows us to thrive.
Ka pai. A stable home that allows us to thrive. That's a really nice statement, which I'll come back to in a moment. I'll just jump over to Greer to give us a little introduction, and then we'll start the ball rolling. So Greer, kia ora, thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, and I'm really interested in the conversation that Shift Aotearoa is facilitating. Housing is obviously a massive topic, and I personally work in the housing space, but also in urban development and regeneration more broadly. So I am a director of a company called the Urban Advisory, and we exist to make all cities good for all people. There's a huge amount of inequality in the way that our cities are created, and the systems and the processes around accessing quality affordable housing is a core component of that. We have spent the last few years really investigating what different models there are that exist overseas that start to answer the question of how you can create thriving communities through providing housing that not only meets their housing need, but also builds community, transfers some of the control back to the community, advocates for participatory democracy and different governance. And so we're really keen to share this knowledge with New Zealand more generally. The government, councils and residents alike are all picking up on the international movements that are happening around community-focused housing, and we are seeing it emerging here in New Zealand. So we're hoping that we can accelerate some of that organic movement that has already started over the last few years. So being able to talk about it in the context of other housing initiatives, Community Housing Aotearoa, the large government state housing program, it's really important. So looking forward to it.
Kia ora. That gives me an idea for a proposition that I should put to you too, which is we do a little bit of a problem definition, because Greer, you've introduced a lot in your introduction, and Imogen, you use the term missing middle, and I think we're going to probably in this conversation roll back around to that, as well as rolling back around to this idea of democratization and bringing control back into communities as a kind of an urban planning necessity, really, but as a tool. So do you think we could take a moment to unpack those two things, you guys? Is that a good, you girls, my participants today? Does that sound okay?
Sure.
So Imogen, tell me a little bit more about the missing middle problem, and how does a society like New Zealand end up with a missing middle?
I suppose I wouldn't say it's only New Zealand that has this, and it seems to be common. I'm Australian, and the Australian housing market also misses, I suppose, much. It's in between the owning your own house and social housing. There obviously is a lot in the rental market, but generally it's poor quality and overpriced, and generally overpriced, particularly where we want to live, where there's resources, amenity, and generally other parts of our life, our working life, are close by. So yeah, it's as you coming to New Zealand, I maybe can't speak to the reasons or how we got here, other than to say it's not an uncommon place for most, I think, first world countries to be experiencing.
Yeah, I would just jump in there and add that other countries have grappled with the issue well before we have, largely because of obviously population density and the need to provide affordable housing close to places of employment. New Zealand's had the luxury, I guess, of affordable housing purely because of our limited population and amount of space that we've had. But we've always had challenges, and there's always been state housing provision. We tend to focus on the very bottom end, or the 10 to 15% of people who struggle the most, and that's very necessary. And what we advocate for doesn't take anything away from the need that exists at that end of the housing continuum. It's just acknowledging that there are plenty of average people who are moderate income earners, so on low to median incomes, that cannot access in our current cities quality affordable housing. And when we say affordable housing, we mean in relation to income. So that's about 30% of one's income spent on housing is deemed to be affordable. We have significant components of our population who are paying over 50% of their incomes on housing. So they're extremely stressed individuals in households. And we think that that's really not good enough. And because there's such a huge focus on the lower 10 to 15% by the government, there has to be different responses coming from different parts of the market. And we have found internationally that they have come from the residents themselves, which is where we get this idea of community-led or community-focused housing. And it really does support those average essential workers, regular people, mum and dads, single people, aging people who are not qualified for elderly housing. It's such a huge range of people that are in need of some extra support, and not just from an affordability perspective, but from the community building perspective. So having those, the solidarity that some of these models provides to people helps contribute to their greater sense of well-being, which obviously is a really important topic.
Interesting. So is it fair to say that this missing middle this missing middle as a group or as a cohort, or that is actually itself really diverse? Like you've mentioned, Greer, that it includes older people and various, I guess what you'd think of as groups within our society who are all facing the same challenge of actually getting into affordable housing. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the breadth of people that exist in our communities is huge, and we currently provide a very limited housing product for the standard 1950s 3-bedroom, 2-car garage, mum and dad, 3 kids. And in reality, our societies are not made up of household composition that reflects that. So you only need to look at demographic statistics to know that Auckland's the 4th most diverse city in the world. So our current housing stock, our supply, does not meet the current demand, and certainly it's not going to meet the future demand. And so you're looking at younger people coming into home ownership who think about home ownership in a completely different way. you have elderly people who might want to downsize, but currently their options are retirement villages or single apartments with one bedroom that are quite honestly depressing. And so we have to provide more options and more residential choices that do meet the diverse needs of our population. You shouldn't be penalised for being a single individual person, but in our housing system you are. You are forced into having to flat if you're a single individual person, or live in really crappy one-bedroom apartments. And there are market responses that are trying to address some of these things, but I genuinely believe that we don't really dig into our housing preferences deeply enough when we're considering what kind of housing we should build in our communities. It's something that our organisation is really passionate about, and it's actually something that we are starting to work more closely with government and councils on, is actually understanding what the future housing demand is, and demand not just around numbers and amounts of bedrooms, which is what we tend to count, but actually what are the preferences of this diverse range of people that we need to serve in our communities. And we find that community-focused housing models tend to be better at meeting those diverse needs because they are more flexible, adaptable, and they're designed generally with input by the community or the residents who are going to live there. So you know you're meeting their needs because they're involved in that process.
Right. Awesome. That's amazing. It reminds me a little bit of part of my conversation with Dr. Robbie Francis Watene yesterday, where we talked about something that's often framed up, maybe incorrectly, as a disabilities access issue, but the issue of choice, the issue of people actually being in the market with choice about where they might want to live, not just suburbs, but typologies. And, I talked about an example of a friend of ours who's looking for a house who, there was one particular house that just had a bus stop right outside. And so you just kind of automatically went, I want that house because it enables me to have X, Y, and Z other parts of my life fit into place. And so I think that idea of choice is really important. And speaking of choice, Imogen, I'll see if I can segue back to you. I take it from what you've mentioned that you've had some experience in the New Zealand rental market recently. How's that been from a perspective of choice and or quality and or other characteristics?
Well, I must say that I have never heard of like a home being cold, like being damp. That concept was foreign to me. I had no idea what that referred to, and just how prevalent it is as well. And I suppose come back to some of the points that Greer made, it's obviously the housing stock is not particularly diverse at all. And yeah, I suppose not unlike Australia, often poor quality and quite expensive at the same time. But by no means do I consider myself to be an expert, as I said before, being a newcomer. But yeah, like I said, the phenomenon of a house being damp and what causes it to be damp was something I'd never encountered before.
So I just want to pick up on that, because I don't want to let that point go, because I guess a part of my reason for asking you that question, Imogen, was because, so here's someone who's come into our housing market from somewhere else with a set of different experiences. So in a sense, you've had a chance to see it with fresh eyes. And so it's I think it's particularly poignant that your reflections on it are in a sense quite graphic and quite straightforward. So I just wanted to give you some context for why I had hoped you would give such an articulate answer to that. So look, I think we've done a good job of kind of setting out some of those issues. So I'm hoping that we're going to be able to talk about a vision or even a solution or some ways forward towards community-focused affordable housing, which is of course our kaupapa today. And so which of you would like to start off on kind of segueing us into what the potential here is?
I can jump in there. Also, our vision around community-focused housing is around enabling communities to be more empowered in their housing futures. So, as I said earlier, the general vision around making cities better for everybody is really underpinned by this idea that for those people to be truly served, they kind of have to be participating in the process and contributing to what that end outcome looks like. So community-focused housing gives us the opportunity to allow people the chance to co-design, to co-govern, to participate in democratic processes, but also to take a more backwards kind of a position if they want to, and be supported by other people to participate. Home ownership's not necessarily the easiest of things to get your head around. It's costly and stressful, and it's sometimes not something that everybody wants to take on at different phases in their life. And so community-focused housing kind of provides a softer landing, I guess, for some people who might be starting on their home ownership journey, or might want to downsize, might want to share the responsibility of home ownership, or might just want to learn. So it's really about allowing people the opportunity to participate to whatever degree they want to in their housing futures.
And so if you can, are you able to give sort of an example of what a project might look like that falls into this category, and how it differs from?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's some really common kind of models. We talk about them as models because they're complex in terms of how they get built, and then how they're owned, and then how they're managed and governed. So co-housing is obviously a big one, probably the most common people understand. Papakāinga is iwi housing for iwi on iwi land, and obviously really important in New Zealand, and I don't purport to be an expert in that area at all, but I think it's a hugely important part of our housing system, and it needs more airtime. A lot of the principles that community-focused housing adopt are very similar, if not the same, to Papakāinga. Obviously, they're not unique to Māori culture, but there's a lot that we can learn from each other. Community land trusts is another name of a model, but that's essentially where you protect the land for the purposes of affordable housing, community benefit forever, and people can own or rent their homes on top of that land. So leasehold is probably the most common way to understand it. However, community land trust models, again, have a level of wraparound services that give the model more structure than a straightforward leasehold ownership arrangement. Cooperative ownership is another model that varies. There's lots of different types of cooperatives around the world, but it's a way to collectively own property. So if you can't individually own a freehold title, you might be able to own a shareholding or an interest in a cooperative entity that owns a building or multiple buildings. So it's a much lower threshold of entry for people, and you don't necessarily own all of the building, so it gets similar to a shared equity scheme, where you might have investors owning part of the building, which again makes it more affordable for the residents who are buying into it. And it's run with a board, and again a democratic process of governance, and people can participate in that to as little or as much as they like. There's obviously experts and stakeholders that are involved in cooperatives and community land trusts because they're slightly more complex, but co-housing is more of a purely resident-led. You get together with a group of people and you find your way through the process of developing housing, which can be very challenging, especially if you're developing apartment building typologies. So that model, it's really coming into its own in New Zealand, but there is a lot of challenges facing that model. So that's just a sort of snapshot overview of different types.
And I was just going to say too, it seems like a lovely option between renting and owning. And you might think that it would be great to have more of an option. And I suppose community-focused affordable housing provides that, as Greer's outlined, you know, in terms of some of the beautiful ways that are the principles around co-housing with shared common areas, and that the really important aspect around creating more of a community amongst your neighbours, and getting a sense of belonging and civic pride. So part of that comes also, as Greer mentioned, being part and involved through the process from early on. So you're part of the community forming, and then as it occupies, you know, it has a beautiful kind of really unusual and different way of belonging and I don't know, getting more than just a home and a place, you know, head over your roof as part of what it can provide for you.
I'm tempted to ask a kind of a really bland question, just so that we can probably unpack, instead of trying to unpack all of those models, or spend the rest of this conversation talking about all of those models. I'm sort of tempted to ask each of you to maybe choose your favourite one, and just actually tell us a little bit more about it. And I guess for you, Imogen, the question would be, which one of those models that Greer's kind of touched on makes the most sense for you from a missing middle perspective? And I'm not assigning that title to you. I'm taking your own assignment of it to yourself, I hope. You know, because I think there's, you know, and this is the challenge of this conversation, is that there's relatively a lot of models, and, you know, we're never going to cover them all successfully in an hour. So which one of them really speaks to you, Greer? Imogen?
So I'd come back again to, I suppose, what I mentioned before about the co-housing, the broad principles, and that those principles can be applied to other models. So it's not necessarily one or the other. I personally have lived in a housing cooperative, which was a really small group of people that had government involvement when I lived in Western Sydney. The aspects around the community element to it was what attracted me to it and what kept me there for a while. The shared garden, shared veggie garden, shared storage, shared carport, made a lot of sense around how we worked. But there were definitely challenges around how we governed and self-managed, and we were a small group. And often international kind of statistics and research would indicate that it's better to have a bigger group, like 20 minimum is generally worthwhile. Greer and I are looking at actually this space professionally, and we've kind of landed that actually it's not necessarily just one but two that fits really well together. So, for example, where Greer mentioned before about community land trust being about the land, and then the cooperative being about the ownership structure on top, actually they fit really well together and are complementary, but also add to the complexity as well. So nevertheless, we haven't seen that yet delivered in New Zealand, but that would be, if you were to ask me, my aspiration for getting it off the ground sometime soon.
Cool, that's interesting. And yeah, I think it's particularly interesting when you starting to think about them in combination with one another. So Greer, how about you? So I guess the question for you I'd repackage a little bit, which is more like, because I think you suggested that some of them are starting to get some traction in New Zealand. So what's one of the models that's really looks like it's working relatively well?
Well, so I wouldn't say it's working relatively well, but it does exist, and it has highlighted a number of challenges around our banking system, our valuation system, and our property system generally. But co-housing is the most popular because it's the most well understood. However, and there was examples of it around New Zealand, from Dunedin right through to the north, and some really well known projects like Co-House in Auckland, but also some probably less well known projects like Cornerstone, which is in Orowaka, and that is looking at a co-housing project for plus 55-year-olds. High Street in Dunedin, Urban Habitat Collective in Wellington. There's groups mobilising in different areas around the country who are also, Queenstown's got one, so sort of happen to be one in every region really. That people find each other. That's not actually my favourite model, because it's not scalable in terms of solving this issue of affordable housing. So what I really like about the community land trust and the cooperative structures is that it's really, really scalable. Both of those are more, they require more investment from the public sector, government and councils to get them up and running. They're more structured, and they have, to a degree, lesser resident participation. But because of that, they're actually more analogous to a product that individual New Zealanders might be able to get on board with. Co-housing can seem a little bit radical and left field to some people, whereas owning a home on a community land trust that is your own home, and if you want, can have a fence around it and 2-car garages and 3 bedrooms, although we don't advocate for those things. You can still independently own that home on community land trust land. So it makes it a more tenable option for people who are perhaps not as experimental with their residential choices. Cooperatives I really like because they're a hybrid between ownership and rental. So it really starts to get to this issue of affordability. And it means that lots of different people at different price points can access housing at different price points. Again, I emphasise these really need assistance from the public sector to get them up and running because they are very different from what we're used to. And there are some hurdles we have around legislation, financing and being able to secure a mortgage, get insurance, the way that the properties are valued. So across the country, councils are looking at implementing community land trusts for the purposes of affordable housing in their communities. And there are a couple of projects that are investigating the possibility of a cooperative rental structure, ownership structure. So I can't answer that question really simply. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I mean, I think it's worth surfacing because it's come up a couple of times, and I guess stating one of the things that it's tempting to skate around in a conversation like this, but we are talking about well, let's say we lived in a society that really valued home ownership and land ownership, and that sense of our home is our palace and the one place where we have the right to exclude others from or whatever. So we're really talking about breaking that down a little bit, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, underpinning this sector, the community focused housing, is kind of this idea of decommodifying housing and decommodifying land. So, and this ties into a discourse that the Shift Aotearoa kind of nutted through last year, which was around housing as a human right. And actually, instead of viewing our housing and the land that it sits on as an investment, as a nest egg, housing is actually an essential service. It's a need that everybody needs to be able to access. And there's other ways to build wealth, and much more productive ways to build wealth, by investing in business, in education, etc. Can't go down that route today, or others will be here forever. Really,
let's do it another day though.
Yeah. But really, at the heart of community focused housing is this idea that we are not looking at housing as our wealth building nest egg. It is about providing people what they need to thrive, as Imogen said at the beginning. So if we can get the idea, people's heads around the idea that land, and particularly being the most expensive part, can be removed from the speculative market and held for the purposes of affordable housing in perpetuity, it means people can still have their palace, their castle, individual access and ownership even of that home, of those improvements on top of the land, but they just can't own the land for the purposes of huge capital gains and speculation. But the benefit they get is secure housing and security and the opportunity to improve the other parts of their lives that you generally tend to be able to do when you've got secure, healthy, warm housing. And so it's about accepting, or for people in New Zealand to accept that your alternative is you can battle it out in the private rental market forever, where you're subject to market rent increases and never have a chance of owning anything. Or you can accept that you're going to be reliant on state housing. Again, you're never going to have the chance to own anything. Or you can be maybe more open-minded about a stepping stone or a time in your life where maybe owning either collectively as part of a cooperative or a home on a leasehold title as opposed to a freehold title. It's a good compromise, and it gives you a lot of those things that people seek from home ownership, which is the security and the safety and the ability for you to focus on other areas of your life and not worry about whether or not your rent's going to go up or whether or not your landlord's going to kick you out. So it's not comparable to market home ownership, but for lots of people that's never going to be a possibility, whereas these different structures give people the chance to own a home, albeit slightly
different kind of way.
In a different way. So what about the sort of question of transferability? You know, so once you've committed to be in a cooperative or in any of these models or a co-housing model or whatever, is your whatever tenure you're using, you can still transfer it. So can you still sell and buy and sell? And so if you want to be in it and you're in it for 5 years and your circumstances change, you know, are your opportunities still basically the same?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, Imogen, feel free to jump in. But yes, so generally you get out what you put in, is the standard rule. So you don't come out worse off. The resale formula attached to the different models varies project to project. Anywhere between you pretty much get out what you put in plus enough to keep up with inflation, so the value of your investment hasn't gone down, through to people getting 10% of the capital gain on a property. And there was examples where they get slightly more, but in a cooperative you get, if you have invested in buying a shareholding in that cooperative, as the model works, you actually get a small return on your investment, like the other investors, the shared equity partners or the social impact investors or the bank gets interest on their money that they've contributed to the cooperative. You as a resident contributing equity, albeit a small amount, gets a small amount of return. So say if you invested in a $55,000 shareholding over 10 years, you get about $10,000 or $11,000 back. Plus, you get your $55,000 back when you leave and you sell your cooperative shareholding back to the cooperative. And was similar with a community land trust, you sell your property back to the community land trust. So in a way, you have more certainty because you're not reliant on market conditions. You're protected from the volatility of the regular housing market because the cooperative or the community land trust buys back your interest, and you know what you're in for because you've agreed those resale criteria or resale restrictions before you purchase.
They're explicit. Yeah. So Imogen, what would you say to I guess to put it blandly again, you know, to New Zealanders, you know, in terms of the need to kind of somehow generate more, well, obviously more public investment in these models, but also I think probably more interest from people in the market as well. Now, what would you say, Imogen, to kind of convince people or attract people to think about these models?
There's a couple of other things I was thinking about as we were talking that I was going to jump in on and add on, but
Please carry on. Please do.
I'm also mindful of, like, obviously the complexity, and that we don't want to necessarily bamboozle either. And I suppose my focus, and I've kind of emphasized all the way along, it's about, for me, the sense of what it can provide that's not just the financial, but the holistic well-being, broader benefits as well, that are really unique and are really hard to find generally in any form of housing in most countries, other than where these models that we've talked through exist. And I suppose largely I see those as, it's not just, obviously it's an affordable home option, but it's also one that can give you somewhere that you can, feel part and belong to for decades, if not necessarily for the, entire time that it meets your needs. And coming back to a little bit around the flexibility question that you asked for, potentially you might see a development done where you've got different typologies. So, you might have a micro unit and you might have a 3-bedroom unit, and possibly along the journey of life, you might want to downsize, and you might have circumstances change. So in a development that meets those broader topology needs, you could stay in the same community, but just move into a different apartment. And depending on how the share is worked out, for the example we provided for the cooperative, you might not necessarily have much of a financial impact at all, particularly in relation to the deposit or the shareholding value that you've got. So, as I see it, for my mum who's elderly, like we pointed out, like I would love to see her be able to be part of a group and part of a society that's not necessarily a retirement home. But imagine the benefits of an elderly person that gets to be around children and about, around younger people, and, the benefits across different generations around, say, they're not necessarily blood related, but they could be, a village raising children and all the other aspects to it as well that are beneficial, that I think are really important to emphasize around this as well. It's way much more than just, an affordable housing option.
This is great. It's segueing nicely into, I guess what is already kind of the wrap-up session of our session. But I want to flag that I'm able to stay a little after 2 o'clock. I'm not sure if you guys are okay to carry on till 10 past or something. Yep. So, I think, what you're talking about really is I guess the case Māori have been trying to make for many, many years about the value of papakainga, many of those intrinsic social values. And I just want to share a really quick story, because when I started with the Shift Aotearoa, I started asking, in a couple of conferences, I asked a question. So I want you to think about, I'd pick someone in the audience and say, I want you to think about a time to do with your housing, and I want you to think about the time when you made a capital gain, and I want you to think about how it felt. And of course the person would kind of become very awkward and feel very almost ashamed of having made a capital gain, and then I'd say, okay, so now I want you to think about the time when you first can remember moving your family into a secure tenure, into a home where you could experience a secure tenure. And so of course suddenly this awkwardness turns into this kind of flourishing sense of, wow, it was such an amazing feeling. And I think, in New Zealand, culturally, maybe we need to engage with precisely what you're saying, Imogen, which is really simply, don't forget the social benefits and the family benefits of being in a secure home.
Especially we have such huge Māori and Pacific communities in New Zealand, and their cultural preferences are to live more collectively and intergenerationally. Collective ownership, but also communal living underpin the Okinawa Māori and Pacific way of life. And so with some of the projects that we're working on, say in Eastern Porirua, they're really excited about this idea that they can truly live intergenerationally and collectively own property. To go back to your point earlier, because Brendan, I think it's a really important one around what we can do to mainstream these kind of options. The first thing is around education and awareness. So people don't know what they don't know. So they don't even know that these things are a possibility. And then they don't know how they work. And obviously there's lots of questions, and it's very natural. And so there has to be investment into building people's knowledge about it, their awareness, but also into the structures and the frameworks that are needed for these things to be established. So in the UK, as an example, there's been a 2,000% increase in community land trusts alone over the last 10 years because the government recognised the value, the social, the economic, the environmental value of community land trusts and invested £38 million, £38 million, it was about 80 million New Zealand dollars, into capability and capacity building of the sector. And that was distributed around the country via enabling hubs. And they really resourced the people who knew about, say, like co-housing or cooperatives and community land trusts. And they supported those groups with funding. And it was both development funding, grant funding for operational costs. And so they really got behind it as a sector and recognised it as a sector. Defining it in their policy and planning documentation was also a really big step that helped it become normalised. And then obviously there's working with the banking sector and the professional services, the quantity surveyors, the builders, the architects, the property valuers, everyone who needs to be involved in a process for them to understand what really underpinned community-focused housing, because it comes from a different position from speculative development, and so it requires a different treatment. Some of the very tangible things were like low interest loans. So in recognition that these are not-for-profit models, the community-focused housing sector was able to access finance at significantly lower interest rates than a speculative property developer would. So those are just a few of the top-level things that I think we need to really mainstream the sector.
Yep. Boy, it's hard to pick something out of those things, but I did want to just ask whichever one of you's got sort of a handle on the numbers. What sort of numbers of these types of developments do we have at the moment in New Zealand? Do you have any idea? Is that too hard a question?
That's quite easy. We have 0 property cooperatives and community land trusts. We have land in trust, and we do have Papakāinga and Hamilton City Council set up, or in the process of setting up a community land trust. And there are lots of properties owned by trust.
Yes. but not for the same purpose.
Not for the same purpose, and not with the wraparound governance and management structures that build community on an ongoing basis and that have the resale restrictions built into them. So in the way we talk about these models, very few examples exist. I'm not going to say none, because I get in trouble when I say that, because there's lots of variation within the models, so it's hard to say that there are none altogether.
Yeah. All right, so I guess here's a bit of a challenge, and I'll just throw one more question to both of you before I invite you both to kind of finally articulate what your vision for a future of housing in New Zealand is, whether it's 10, 20 or 50 years or 100 or whatever number. So just before we do that, I'd just like you to let me know if there's what are the top 2 regulatory challenges that could be, that, you know, because regulatory challenges generally can be addressed by good evidence and a good case and managing to influence some people, but
yeah, so our land disposal
council land disposal
in government, so it's not necessarily legislation, it's kind of a policy implementation issue. But where organisations are required to make a financial return on land, they are pigeonholed into doing a certain amount of things with that land. And so it makes discounting land or retaining land very difficult because they're required to make a financial return on that land. So that's one massive thing. And then access to finance on terms that are favourable. and not that it's free money, it's not a grant, although small grants to help with capacity building are important, but actually low interest capital, whether it's through the banks or government bonds or social impact investors or some of the institutional funds, would really, really unlock the sector. So in Switzerland, 25% of their housing is cooperatively owned, because if you're a cooperative, you can access finance at 1 or 2%, long-term patient capital.
Wow, that's an amazing example. And what's that phrase that's used in the public land space, which is, public and best use, or
highest and best use generally.
Highest and best use. So we say highest and best social and economic use, because it shouldn't be just a financial benchmark.
That's right. So can we just unpack that for a moment? So what's...
Guys, sorry, I just wanted to jump in if I can to answer the other question.
Please.
All right. So I want to actually unpack a bit about what Greer said. So yes, there's the requirement, I suppose, for government to do regeneration work. So often when you think about a program in a certain location, generally it means that they're purchasing land, doing different things with it, often with a variety of uses to get a variety of outcomes. And I think really what we need to be saying is that gentrification is a real possibility where we have got government investment in specific locations. Potentially if they're improving infrastructure and an amenity and all that kind of stuff, there's a broad array of upgrades. We need to be really mindful that there is a real risk of gentrification. So when we've got potentially some entities requesting or wanting a certain array of housing outcomes, if we don't give some tools and some ways of enabling that to be achieved, we're not going to see it happen. So I'm not an expert, but I understand that there was a inclusionary zoning period of time where we were looking at that, making that almost mandated. And it would seem as though maybe we've moved away from any one development achieving a broad array of, affordability typologies within the one development. But maybe what we could do is, where we've seen, as I understand, places like the Netherlands, they've actually said, we want community-focused housing in this location. We're going to zone it so that that's all that can happen there. And I think that that's where we've got to, and that largely in an election year that's a few months away, ideally would be broadly asking to see outcomes like that to get us closer to achieving the broad array of housing that we need, and particularly more community-focused affordable housing. So I'm not necessarily touching on the financial mechanisms, and Greer's in a much better position to talk about that, but coming from a government leadership perspective and how we treat and value land, that's where I believe the real ticket and the real change can occur. It's not necessarily difficult and that far away maybe to achieve if there's the will to do it.
Yeah, I really re-emphasize that inclusionary zoning, defining it as a product that fits within the broader range of products that exist, and taking the leadership to pilot projects, support projects in different ways, whether it's through provision of land, discounted land, guarantees or underwrites. If we can do Kiwi Build, we can look to invest in different ways to support affordable housing products. And it really does come down to a leadership role that Imogen's raised.
Mm. Yeah, those are some pretty chunky regulatory issues to be throwing around. I mean, I really love the alignment. I'm just going to say something quickly. I really loved your little articulation, Greer, of how you linked what you were talking about earlier about the decommodification as linking back to that human rights. Thanks for putting that, that front and center. But I also, the link between this idea of inclusionary zoning matched with this idea that we've got at the moment this public sector practice of disposal. I mean, even that word is just a bizarre word to use for the process of giving land out of the public hands into private hands.
Yeah.
Very strange. I mean, those things seem a good Good
So,
place.
land is a finite resource, and where they somehow manage to make more land from reclaimed seabeds, etc., is a rare occasion. So let's suggest that land is a finite resource, and therefore governments all around the world are actually realising that retention of public land needs to underpin their land strategy, because once it goes to the private market, it's very hard to get it back without paying a premium for it, and that payment is always going to be passed on in terms of housing affordability. And so policy and legislation in cities where they're really progressive around their home ownership structures and how they provide affordable housing, they've all actually moved to retain land only to be used for the purposes of not-for-profit housing models that demonstrate higher environmental and social outcomes, and they have really, really, really stringent requirements about who they will essentially make land available to. And even if you're a private developer, Vienna has some of the leading kind of policies in the world around this. If you're a developer, you have to meet that higher standard of environmental and social performance to even have a chance of getting a leasehold interest on land to develop property. And as Imogen pointed out, you have to provide a certain amount of affordable housing within that. To make that easier and to incentivise people to do that, they have concessions for their equivalent to like development contributions, or the way that GST is considered, and the way that they get their planning permits. So the government's really stepped in and said, like, we're going to recognise that for you, the trade-off for a reduced profit, we're going to make this easier through these sort of like regulatory interventions. And so, yeah.
Right. So, I guess in summary, there's a bunch of regulatory things that could change, and if they all changed, that would be great.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Imogen, I'll just do a little bit of a debrief and a reminder to our audience, whoever they might be, of what we've been talking about today, while I give you an opportunity, Imogen, to think about what you're going to tell us about your vision for the future, and then I'll come back to you, Greer. So kia ora koutou. I've been talking today with Greer O'Donnell and Imogen Schutz about the kaupapa of community-focused affordable housing. We've traversed a range of models and a range of barriers and a range of opportunities. And now I'm going to throw back to Imogen to let us know, if you haven't already, Imogen, what your vision for the future of housing in Aotearoa is.
That everyone can access an affordable home that is quality, that promotes wellness and it allows them to thrive, that's built on sustainability and wellness, I suppose, principles and foundations, and that they have a sense of belonging, and it's a place that they can stay in and with forever if they want to, and it meets the changing needs of their lifestyle as they age.
Awesome. And what's the time frame for that vision, Greer? Imogen, would you like to?
We've got a few barriers as we've already run through, so there's a bit to work through to achieve that for sure. So let's give it, I don't know, 20, 30 years?
All right.
Ideally, my lifetime, I'd like to see that happen.
Yeah. Thanks, Imogen. And how about you, Greer? What's your vision for the future?
Yeah, my vision really is just that everyone has the housing choice that meets their needs, and not only their needs but their preferences. So where housing is not a commodity, where people are connected, where social isolation is no longer an issue, where sustainable housing is a norm, not something to be celebrated, where people have what they need and not huge amounts more than what they need, because that means that everyone has the opportunity to have housing choices that serve them in a way that means not only is it affordable, but it provides those other fundamental elements that human beings, they need to thrive, as Imogen's quite articulately put it beforehand.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, guys. It's been super informative to hear you guys talk about this kaupapa, and pretty inspiring as well. And in fact, I'm already thinking about listening back to it so that I can pick up some of those gems, but also some of those specific regulatory challenges, which, as I say, might be some of the easier things to change than people's preconditioned minds about how they want to own homes. But thanks so much for joining me with the Shift Aotearoa and Vision Week, and look forward to chatting with you again soon. So I'm going to stop the recording now, and you can stay on for a debrief or catch up another time.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. It's been great.